Ladies and gentlemen, those whom I have not met yet, I'm Subrata Mitra, Director of ISAS. It's my great joy, on behalf of my colleagues and guests, to welcome Professor Sanjeev Barua to our midst. Joining us in welcoming Sanjeev are two other institutes, the Asia Research Institute, generously brought to us by Professor Prasenjit Dwara, but also the South Asia Studies Program, of which several colleagues, including Manjusha, who is now ours, but originally theirs, writer in residence, and, well, this is the point about being interdisciplinary. We can be interdisciplinary in many ways. Also joining us is Professor Ganesh Kudesia, who has brought us a lot of resources, and a surprise, surprise, my former student and dear friend, Professor Catherine Adeny from Nottingham, Director of the Asia Pacific Center of Nottingham University, is also with us today, and a whole lot of people attracted by Sanjeev. The full title of the talk is India and its Northeast, Reflections on a Peculiar Relationship. Professor Barua is Professor of Political Studies at Bard College, New York, and Honorary Research Professor at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. His books include India Against Itself, Assam and the Politics of Nationality, and Durable Disorder, Understanding the Politics of Northeast India. He writes regularly. There is an opinion column which appears in newspapers, including the Indian Express, Asian Age, and Telegraph. We are delighted to have Sanjeev with us because the topic itself is of terrific importance in its own right, but for ISAS, it's doubly important because ISAS is trying to open up following the whole idea of pulling together ASEAN and South Asia. We are trying to expand our area of investigation eastwards. So the Northeast is achieving a great centrality. The Northeast would become an extended hinterland, we hope, also for Bangladesh, and Ambassador Chaudhary has this idea of a whole new workshop on port cities of South Asia with Chittagong as the focus. Again, those things would make a lot of sense. But none of it would make sense if the fulcrum doesn't hold, if India doesn't hold together. But can India hold together on the terms that India alone sets without consulting India's periphery? These and other politically incorrect things are part of the brand recognition of Sanjeev as we knew him in Delhi as fellow students along with Prasenjit, and you have made a whole career out of it. And behind closed doors, under Chatham House rules, we'll hear a lot more about it. Another reason I'm very pleased to have you all listen to Sanjeev is because ISAS itself is rebranding its intellectual repertoire. We have adopted democracy, diplomacy, and development as sort of the 3 Ds, not just for South Asia, but in general and in comparative perspective. Now, a group of social scientists working on policy have to have this kind of proactive research agenda, which is why the specific topics here quickly meander into a much larger formulation, which is why I've invited Professor Prasenjit Dwara to moderate the conversation. Sanjeev will speak for about 30 minutes? Or
a bit more maybe?
Okay. Well, you take your time.
Okay.
And then I'll simply open it to a general conversation, and Prasenjit, you'll please take over from there. Is that okay? Okay. Good. Then you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here and to speak to a number of old friends, new friends. It's really, some of us go back a long time. Subrata Mitra, Prasenjit Dwara, we are contemporaries in Delhi University. So it's been very... So, but you know, it's in some ways, I'm delighted to be in ISAS, and many of us wear different hats. I'm spent time in the Center for Policy Research in Delhi, but this is distinctly not a policy paper. By which I mean I'm sure all of you will respect the space to think boldly, think clearly. It's not, doesn't mean one has all works out all those issues, but sometimes it is helpful too. So this is a kind of literally it says today's date because I was working on it till this morning. So it is really thinking about it, I'm calling it India and its Northeast, Reflections on a Peculiar Relationship. So I'm going to read out because it is really an argument and I think that the details matter, the nuances matter. New Delhi's relations with Northeast India are peculiar. The region's official name itself is odd. Directional place names are not unusual, but generally they're informal proper nouns, as in North India or South India. Northeast India, however, is an official name, an artifact of deliberate policy. It's now a common way of talking about the region. It's convenient. It saves the trouble of remembering the names of those faraway states, their peoples, and the languages spoken there. And thanks to a racialized regime of visuality, Northeasterner has become an acceptable way to refer to people from the region. The term may have its roots in British colonial times, but as an official place name, its career is very recent. It conjures up a political security arrangement that took shape in the 1960s and 1970s, when the affairs of the region became securitized, to use the language of the Copenhagen School of International Relations. Developments in the region came to be seen as potentially constituting existential threats to the nation and thus belonging to a realm beyond or outside normal politics. Northeast India as a place name is inseparable from this history of securitization. So here I have a brief account of that phase I'm talking about. I'm calling it crafting a political security architecture. The 1960s were tumultuous years in India's post-colonial history. India and China fought a war in 1962. The movement for Naga independence got into full swing, and the Mizo insurgency began in 1966. After India's defeat in the war with China, Delhi began to fear that there could be a formidable threat to national security if the country's external and domestic enemies come together. Securitization invariably produces emergency measures that call for silence and speed, not thoughtful debate and deliberation. One of the most damaging and lasting effects of decisions made at this time of panic politics on the political life of Northeast India is the territorialization of ethnicity. The state of Nagaland was created in 1963, a year after the China War, with New Delhi hoping to end the Naga conflict by creating stakeholders in the pan-Indian dispensation. This was the first step in the setting up of a new political security architecture. The most comprehensive step was the Northeast Areas Reorganization Act passed by the Indian Parliament in 1971. The same year saw a dramatic change in the wider region's political geography, the breakup of Pakistan and the emergence of Bangladesh. A number of new laws created new administrative units in Northeast India or changed the status of existing units. All the units acquired the trappings of statehood as full-fledged units of federal India. B.P. Singh, a senior Indian civil servant holding key positions both in the region and India's Home Ministry during the period, described the Northeast Areas Reorganization Act of 1971 and another law creating the Northeastern Council the same year as twins born out of a new vision for the Northeast. Thus, the Northeast, he wrote, emerged as a significant administrative concept, replacing the hitherto more familiar unit of public imagination, Assam. In previous writings, I have called this regional architecture a cosmetic form of federalism, showing that a parallel structure with the governor as the node permits the national security establishment to play a key role in the everyday governance of the states. The arrangement probably is not foreordained to serve only those original goals. Some writers seem to think that this architecture could in principle take Indian federalism in a fruitful asymmetrical direction in future. However, I don't think political developments thus far point in that direction. I believe that an agenda of desecuritization may be a precondition for building a peaceful and democratic Northeast India. A textual analysis of the Indian Home Ministry's website makes it abundantly clear that national security considerations continue to frame official thinking on the region. Its Northeast division deals with developmental and security issues. It's a separate division from two others that deal with internal security matters in the rest of the country. Is because, I quote, unlike other parts of the country, the Northeast holds an important position from a strategic point of view, as these states share the borders with other countries like Bangladesh, Bhutan, Myanmar, China. The region is said to have a fragile security situation. Again, a quote. There is violence quote again, and that's the problem with reading, of course. Sometimes the quotations and my words get mixed up, so I'll try to make it clear. So here I'm often using Home Ministry language. There is violence and diverse demands by various Indian insurgent groups. I thought the word Indian there was interesting. It hints at a structural kind of explanation for this state of affairs and points at a potpourri of factors. The fact that the region is a borderland, its supposed location on a prior stage of developmental temporality compared to the modern parts of the country, peculiarities of the region's historical inheritance, etc. Apparently, this example is a textual analysis, so now you're getting my interpretation of this. Apparently, these factors conspire to produce a perception among the people that they exploited and a feeling of alienation. Policies that follow from this diagnosis clearly can only be like palliative medicine for illnesses for which there is no present cure. Only prodigious economic and social change that could take place in the indeterminate future could change the effects of such a stubborn set of structural factors. It's not surprising that India's central government has a Ministry of Development of the Northeastern region. No other region has a central government department dedicated to its development. Then a sentence I have which draws on Tanya Lee's work. A structure of permanent deferral is inherent in such a vision, and those that need development are necessarily set apart from those that do the development. In the meantime, the Home Minister's mission seems to be to keep the region safe from the nation's enemies and to manage and control symptoms. Fissures is my next section. Northeast India is India's geographical and cognitive periphery, often imagined as its internal other, and represented in ways that reek of exoticism and internal Orientalism. A significant part of Northeast India's population, majorities in the states of Mizoram, Meghalaya, and Nagaland, are Christians. Christianity in this part of the world, as in many other parts of the post-colonial world, is seen as our religion, not a foreign religion. Western missionaries may have pioneered proselytization and conversion, but the agents of proselytization have long been Indian nationals and locals. We do not take Christianity as foreign religion any more than we consider the light of the sun as foreign, declared Naga nationalist leader Angami Fizo. But such assertions don't go well with the ideas of national space and territory of Hindu nationalist ideologues, whose political clout has been on the rise. Hindu nationalist ideology draws on Hinduism's sacred geography, the stories of Hindu gods and heroes that link mountains, rivers, forests, and villages and turn them into a living landscape. Northeast India is now a priority region for these organizations. Stories from the Hindu epic Mahabharata are important tools in their ideological arsenal. Their favorite stories seem to revolve around female characters supposedly from Northeast India and link matrimonially to Hindu gods and heroes. These are the other women of the Mahabharata. Thus, Ulupi and Chitrangada, two women married to Arjuna, were supposedly Naga and Manipuri princesses respectively. Krishna's consort Rukmini, a Missimi girl from Arunachal Pradesh, and Bhim's wife Hirimbi, a Dimasa woman from Assam. The narrative of India's geographical unity as a sacred landscape is deployed to challenge and marginalize arguments for autonomy and self-determination, especially those that foreground a difference from Hindu India. Views expressed by the current crop of senior government functionaries reflect a sense of discomfort about Northeast India's religious demography. No less a person than Padmanabha Balakrishna Acharya, the present governor of Assam and Nagaland, the constitutional head of the two state governments, has made the startling allegation that uttering the name of the Hindu god Krishna is forbidden in certain parts of Northeast India. If you say Hare Krishna, he has said you will be punished. In order to change the mindset, Acharya proposes the acronym Namaste. Nagaland, Arunachal, Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, etc. Acharya was appointed governor of Nagaland in July 2014, following the BJP's electoral victory in the national elections. Like Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Acharya is a long-term member of the Hindu nationalist RSS. Naga scholar Arkotong Longkumer believes that Acharya's appointment as governor signaled the organization's larger geopolitical strategy in Nagaland. Independently of the rise of Hindu nationalism, India's official nationalism has never been particularly effectual in providing a foundation for legitimate public power in Northeast India. The very moment of India's independence, after all, saw the beginning of the Naga movement for independence. We have our own culture and civilization, said Fizo, which our forefathers developed centuries ago. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, found that it is impossible to consider even for a moment such an absurd demand as that for independence for Nagas. That's his words. His government's response to the Naga movement turned it into one of the world's most enduring armed conflicts. The conflict, however, may finally be heading towards a settlement, A framework agreement was signed between the government and the NSC and IM in August 2015. The government's symbolic acknowledgement of the equality of the sides engaged in Indo-Naga talks, as NSCN likes to describe the talks, has brought the negotiations to this point. The unique history of the Nagas has emerged as a key phrase. The Naga leaders read the Indian government's public acceptance of this idea as recognition of equality. It's also taken to mean that the government doesn't regard the Naga conflict as a run-of-the-mill separatist insurgency. But there's no evidence that these meanings are widely shared across government circles. Translating these symbols into an institutional form acceptable to the two sides and to other important stakeholders in the conflict remains a formidable challenge. Then I have a section, I'm still doing Fisher's, called Enduring Legacies of Counterinsurgency. Multiple insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, especially the intense intersubjectivity and the relationships of cooperation and trust developed by people in the time of counterinsurgency, have had a constitutive role in the crystallization of political identities in Northeast India. The Nagas are not the only people with this experience. All Northeast Indian states except Sikkim have experienced counterinsurgency. Though these operations are not all alike, and nor is counterinsurgency always a uniform experience. Today's Mizoram, for instance, here I draw on the work of William Van Chandel, who is here. Today's Mizoram, for instance, went through a wholesale militarization, massive force resettlement, and warlike conditions. This is a quotation. The Mizo revolt ended in 1986. The Mizo Peace Accord is often held out as a poster child of the government's effective conflict management strategy and the success of counterinsurgency. But this and other peace settlements, I shall argue, tell a more complicated story than the ultimate triumph of nation building. During the 50s and 60s, military operations against the Nagas and Mizos saw the use of some of the most repressive methods available in the repertoire of counterinsurgency, including village regrouping. Anthropologist Nandini Sundar tells us that Mizos call the days of village regrouping kokhom, being driven helter-skelter, a term that sums up a world of terror like the Palestinian Nakba, or a catastrophe to refer to the forcible evacuation of 1948. In Nagaland, people mark time in terms of memories of regrouping, with expressions like the year we came back from the jungle. Conventional accounts of the history of counterinsurgency in independent India are typically framed within a narrative of gradual maturation of the government's counterinsurgency capacity. The focus of this operation supposedly is winning the hearts and minds of people. Yet, but Nandini Sundar's field research among Naga and Mizo survivors indicates that even decades later, people do not remember anything about campaigns for hearts and minds. They remember the search operations, the starvation, the regime of curfews and a reduction of identity to a roll call and a piece of paper. If Mizo youth culture is Western, as many Indians seem to think, it's because it bears traces of the time of counterinsurgency. Even Mizos unsympathetic to the revolt saw the Indian army, here a quotation from William and Joy Pachwa's book, invaders with no respect for the people of Mizoram. At that time, Indian cultural practices lost the limited appeal, Hindi songs were cold-shouldered, and Indian ideas of fashion and decorum were rejected. Counterinsurgency has been no less nightmarish in recent years than those occurred in the 50s and 60s. The closing years of the last century in Assam were bleak. Secret killers or death squads carried out a wave of extrajudicial killings against suspected Ulfa cadres and sympathizers. The killings were portrayed as factional warfare between surrendered Ulfa militants and Ulfa. Designed to strike terror inside Ulfa, these extrajudicial killings even targeted parents and siblings of Ulfa members, put intense emotional and moral pressure on Alpha members. A former Alpha leader attributes the surrenders by Alpha almost entirely to the brutal campaign of counterinsurgency. When the parents and siblings of Ulfa's lower level cadres become targets, said this leader, Chaudhary, only surrender could spare their loved ones this terrible fate. Aruni Kashyap's novel, The History with 1,000 Stories, very nice new English novel, is set against the backdrop of these killings by death squads. His book is in English, but there's a number of widely read works of fiction in Assamese about this dark period in the history of post-colonial Assam, many of them by women writers. They tell the story of how violence was experienced by ordinary people. In the words of literary critic Amit Baisya, they give narrative and figurative shape to the experience of terror. Since I talk about Ulfa, I have a little section about Ulfa, but I won't get into much details. I'll read the small part of it. The rise of United Liberation Front of Assam was rather unexpected. Unlike the Naga and Mizo territories, the pan-Indian anti-colonial nationalist movement had a significant presence in the plains of Assam. In the eyes of many people of the hills, the plains Assamese and the state government of undivided Assam, dominated by them, was the face of Indian misrule. The state government was the target of Mizo and Naga insurgencies. The rise of Ulfa illustrates the fluidity of the relations on which national identities are founded, an argument that Prasenjit Dwara had made so eloquently. Conditions that shape political identities don't stay the same. Assamese political identity that may have been temporarily submerged in a pan-Indian identity during the final battle for state power in 1947, but reasserted itself soon after. Ulfa emerged during an extended period of political turmoil in Assam in the late 70s and 1980s over the so-called foreigner question. Conflicting expectations from the partition of 47 and a discordant memories of it are at the root of the controversy. I can get into it, but I'll skip that in the interest of time. Then I have a section which I call, still on the fission, Strangers in the City and New Politics of Race. Large numbers of people from Northeast India now live in the heartland. The numbers living in Delhi is estimated to be at least 200,000. In Bangalore, the estimated number is more than 300,000. The substantial number in cities like Hyderabad, Chennai, Pune, Mumbai, and Kolkata. Job opportunities in the service sectors of these booming cities have been a magnet. In Delhi's restaurants, shopping malls, hotels, spas, call centers, and the airline industry, the English-speaking skills and the, quote, oriental looks of young Northeasterners, and of women in particular, are in great demand. In consumer spaces that project a global aesthetic, responding to the desire of many Indians to live abroad in India, this is not my term, a sociologist has coined that term, Northeasterners appear to have become essential accessories. As a Naga employee at a high-end store in Delhi told Duncan McDowell, an ethnographer of this, for Indians it's like going to Bangkok for shopping. We look the same, but some of us can't even speak Hindi. For negotiating everyday life in metropolitan India, Northeasterner has now become an indispensable word to refer to this new visible minority. The Mongolian Fringe, the title of a 1940 official paper by Olaf Caro, the Foreign Secretary of British Indian government in New Delhi, provides clues to this development. Caro uses the phrase in reference to British India's informal empire in the Himalayan region, Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan, as well as what he called northern Assam. In Caro's eyes, the area had a predominantly Mongolian population, within quote, that's his term, despite the clearly non-Mongolian nature of the Nepalese ruling family. Lovely old kind of colonial race. An unabashedly racialized view of the world characterized this genre of imperial geopolitical writing. The racial term Mongolian, according to prevailing theories of race, applied to most people of Central and Eastern Asia, including Tibetans, Chinese, and the Japanese. To Caro, the divide between Mongolians and the inhabitants of India proper was self-evident. This racialized gaze was not limited to colonial officials. Speaking about the implications of the Chinese takeover of Tibet, independent India's first Home Minister Patel wrote to Nehru that, I quote, the undefined state of the frontier and the existence on our side of a population with its affinities to the Tibetans or Chinese have all the elements of potential trouble between China and ourselves. 6 decades later, such racial ideas are no longer publicly articulated with the same confidence. But there is what culture studies scholar Joseph Pugliese calls a racialized regime of visuality. In cities like Delhi, Northeast Indians complain of the use of the derogatory words like chinky and flat-nosed. But as Caro's term Mongolian Fringe would suggest, what Indians perceive as stereotypical phenotypes or Northeasterners are not unique to people from the region. Dwellers of the Western Himalayas, those from Nepal or Uttaranchal, or an Indian of Tibetan or Chinese ethnicity would share similar features. And not all Northeasterners would have those phenotypic features. But in the summer of 2012, the reality of this racialized regime of visuality came to the surface with a vengeance when there was an exodus of panicked Northeasterners from major Indian cities. It followed rumors of reprisals in response to what the social media reported as attacks on Muslims in the Bodoland area of Assam. Muslim activists organized a rally in Mumbai to protest the violence against Muslim Rohingyas in Myanmar and Muslims of East Bengali descent in Assam. Photoshopped images and video footage circulating on the social media were included in the stock of reprisals. Some of the most widely circulated morphed images had the origins in events that occurred in China and Thailand. Everyone who looks vaguely Northeastern, be it Nepali, Assamese, Nagas, or Mizos, said a news report from Bangalore, was quick to head to the train station to return to the safety of home. A miasma of fear, doubt, and anxiety has descended on the city, wrote Lawrence Liang, a Chinese-Indian lawyer from Bangalore. It's possible that much of this has been fueled by rumors and hearsay, he wrote, and while the rumors may be false, the fear sadly isn't. So then I have some concluding thoughts which I call, so they are somewhat theoretical, what I call nation building and unbuilding. What can this heartland, borderland dynamics in a post-colony, what I've called a peculiar relationship, tell us about shifts in the order of things, about the global history of the nation form, about the nation state as an institution, and about nation building as a project? The familiar flow of news about armed conflicts and political violence in Northeast India has been punctuated in recent years by reports of ceasefires, armed surrender ceremonies by rebel groups, and peace settlements. It's tempting to write this story as a narrative of Delhi slowly overcoming the difficult challenges of nation building in the region. But such an account will miss crucial aspects of the protocols of peace building and the quality of peace. The film that many of you saw by Pankaj Butalia, I liked it because I see it as an account of this, what I call the protocols of peace building, those camps, etc. Peace settlements often fail to reduce violence, and when they succeed, it's hard to describe the peace as liberal or democratic. The contours of peace settlements, as much as a history of armed conflict and political violence, point to strains in the nation-state form. Large data sets on armed conflicts indicate that a significant number of them do not end in victory or defeat or peace, but in a draw. It's not surprising then that the peace settlements in Northeast India would embody political outcomes that are ambiguous. Insurgencies, we know, are not purely, here's a quotation from somebody, adversarial clash of wills between insurgents and the state for achieving a monopoly of the legitimate use of violence. In Northeast India, deals are sometimes struck between a government and an insurgent faction without meaningful demobilization and decommissioning of arms. The successive waves of ethnic violence following two Bodo peace accords were entirely predictable. Even without overt violence, where erstwhile militants become partners of the government at the state or a local level, their demonstrated military prowess becomes part of local political equations. An armed organization's reputation vis-a-vis its capacity for violence can go a long way. These are inherently illiberal peace settlements that produce hybrid local political regimes when a state and a non-state armed entity formed an informal partnership. Even a well-regarded peace settlement such as the Mizo Accord of 1986 had serious illiberal implications. A number of writers have written about ex-insurgents and Mizo civil society organizations squelching dissent. Conflicts between Mizos and groups like Mars and Reangs have grown because of the territorialization of ethnicity and the fact that a peace settlement reified the idea of an exclusive Mizo homeland. Because of the primacy accorded to a majoritarian notion of Mizo identity in the peace accord, some minorities began to feel that their cultures couldn't flourish in Mizoram. Many others have accepted their de facto second-class status. All peace settlements include New Delhi's commitment to significantly increase funds dedicated to the development of a particular ethnically defined region, a state, a district, or an autonomous region within a state. They give leaders of armed organization in their new incarnation as a local governing authority control over significant resources, and more importantly, opportunities for rent extraction through access to public office. Such hybrid local political regimes could be seen as examples of outsourced sovereignty. They are signs of what Jean and John Komarov has described as, a quotation, a shift in populist conceptions of nationhood from one founded on cultural homogeneity and horizontal fraternity, itself always more an imaginative fiction than a palpable fact, to one that recognizes its own heterogeneity, if often for pragmatic rather than ethical reasons. There is probably no better statement on the illiberal protocols of peace of Northeast India than the status of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. AFSPA is how I'll use the abbreviation. It's designed to provide the legal framework for counterinsurgency operations, but it remains in the books independently of actual conditions on the ground, albeit as a sleeping act, a phrase used by the Mizoram government to describe the status of the law in that state. This law is kept in a ready-to-use manner so that the government with a simple notification can declare an area, an entire state or parts of a state to be disturbed and deploy the armed forces. The large presence of Indian security forces and the effective legal impunity they enjoy under this law produces significant citizen insecurity. A law that enables the suspension of fundamental freedoms by executive decision with barely a hint of public deliberations can only be read as an institutionalized expression of the national elite suspicion of the region. It makes Northeast India an anomalous zone. Here a legal formulation by somebody, a quotation, a geographical area in which certain legal rules otherwise regarded as embodying fundamental policies of the larger legal system are locally suspended. Criticism of this law is usually framed by the traditional discourse of human rights, the mobilization of shame. It is not my intention to reproduce that hackneyed critic. Perpetrators of violence in our age of publicity do not fear the exposure of violence. There is an impasse in the debate on AFSPA. Human rights activists point to its patently undemocratic provisions, and some argue that it amounts to an undeclared long-term emergency. Official India and India's majority public opinion, however, appear to view AFSPA as a matter of routine public order policing. The armed forces coming to the assistance of civil powers has long been part of public order policing in India. I got a lot out of Ganesh Kudeshya's work on this, in understanding the history of this. The army and other forces under the control of the central government are frequently called upon to intervene in communal riots. Most Indians look at these interventions positively, especially since state police forces are often partisan. These are quick in and out operations, to be sure, but in terms of the knowledge and experience inscribed into the institutional practices of the post-colonial Indian state, these operations and those covered by AFSPA belong to the same broad category of public order policing. In the Indian official view, backed by the Indian Supreme Court, the law doesn't raise any constitutional red flags so long as the armed forces assist civil powers and not supplant them. And when it comes to human rights, the army's standard internal mechanisms are considered to be good enough safeguards. That the majority public opinion and the judiciary of a democracy would view a law like AFSPA as a necessity may not be as surprising as it first seems. Consider a new meaning that the term nation building has acquired in recent years. My generation, our generation really, quite a few of us, has known two iterations of nation building. The first time as an earnest project, the second time as a farce. At the end of colonial rule, it was a project of mobilizing a nation's indigenous cultural resources to provide a post-colonial state a legitimizing foundation. Its second iteration could not be more ironic. Is now an imperial project, or at least a task assigned to international regimes of intervention. A publication entitled Nation Building and Counterinsurgency After Iraq regards nation building as something that a US military does. When the US invaded Iraq in 2003, says this author, no military in the world had more nation building experience. Nation building is now defined as the use of armed force in the aftermath of a conflict to promote enduring peace and establishing a representative government. American comedian Kathleen Madigan tells a story that captures the paradox of nation building 2.0 much better than I can. In 2010, during a tour of Afghanistan, she met a young Marine captain at a forward operating base in Helmand province. The captain, pointing to a nearby Afghan village, listed the things that his unit was doing there. It was building a school, a health clinic, and a local government office. It was training and reforming the police, setting up grievance resolution procedures, and working on improving agricultural productivity. In addition, he said, there was a US Marine female engagement team promoting gender equality. At that point, Madigan couldn't resist. She interrupted him and asked, Marine Captain, when are you going to invade Detroit? Thank you. Invade Detroit. Thank you very much.
I would now invite Professor Prasenjit Dwara to start his moderation.
Okay, so I don't need a mic. I have a pretty loud voice. So I can do it from here.
All right.
Oh, thank you anyway. Well, you know, I expected this to be a very perceptive and also delightful talk, and indeed I was not disappointed. In fact, it exceeded my expectations. And since I've been given this chair, I may as well say a few things. But I'll try to be brief. I thought it was very, very interesting, the whole argument and the whole sort of construction of your piece. You know, what first occurred to me is the comparison with when you began to talk about Northeast India. Of course, there was a Northeast China that was made under almost exactly the same conditions. Northeast China, what used to be called Manchuria, and which was in fact dominated, well, the Manchus came from there, they kept it off limits to mainland Chinese. It's called mainland Chinese, you know, versus Northeast. And then, you know, all these imperial powers, Russia, Japan, US, and so on, sort of began to go for it 100 years before. And it was ultimately colonized by, but there were lots of minorities there. Right? The Manchus were the biggest and the most powerful. It's as if the Nagas took over, or the Ahoms took over Delhi. Something like that, right? So, but there were all these. But you know, what a difference. And they still call it Northeast, through exactly the same process of creating provinces, administrative this, that, and the other. Of course, there was a long 30-year interlude where the Japanese dominated it. And so then you had also a lot of quislings and local collaborators and all of these things. So it's a very sensitive point in Chinese politics, and you know, it's huge. It's much bigger than the equivalent. In the ratio of China to Manchuria is I mean, Assam to India is much smaller in that sense. What we call Assam, and so the. So I thought that was very interesting, but what couldn't be more different is the history of the evolution into nation building. That happened really through the communist period, from the communist period, very much in the 20th century mode that you and I have, you know, are being nostalgic about, right? Well, it had its own degrees of suppression, repression, but conditions were different. Not every ethnic group could do whatever it wanted, although the Japanese didn't, you know, assisted them to try and do whatever they wanted. But anyway, so that was, I thought, a very interesting difference. What are the present circumstances of state formation which you bring out, particularly, I would say, post 9/11. In a sense, these have crystallized. The outsourcing of sovereignty has crystallized. The outsourcing of sovereign nation building has crystallized in multiple ways. I mean, you know, you have the US Army doing it or some other army doing it, which then outsources it to somebody else. Then you outsource it to a faction within the rebels, right? And then you get a whole logic. But I thought what was very interesting is how that logic ends up in Pankaj Bhutalia's film that we saw, where actually, apart from the refugee centers, the state was not there for us to see. It was basically communities. It became a Hobbesian war of all against all. But this is the result of your of this outsourcing, right? I mean, what happens? You have you empower a faction who gets in there. They begin to pick up all kinds of things. They need to keep this ethnic identity thing going. So the Boros fight against Karbis, and the Bangladeshi or Muslims are targeted, and then they get back, and all kinds of things. This keeps going on. What I wanted to understand a little more, and this is where I'll end, is what is the mechanism of that? What is the role of communities? What is the role of agents? And what is the role of the state? And has it redounded to the state actually becoming relatively autonomous from this whole thing, so that the target is no longer the state? I mean, you and I think it's the state, but it's no longer the state. The target is ordinary people of the other community, right? And how much of a global phenomenon is this in the shatter zones of the world, right? I mean, clearly Pakistan seems to be almost the same. So, okay, open the floor, sorry.